If that's okay. And if anything,
Good
I'm asking
afternoon.
is a bad question, say the word automobile.
I'm Iris Bonet. I join you from across the river. I'm the academic dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm also a co-chair of the Behavioral Insights Group at the Center for Public Leadership at HKS. It's an enormous honor for me to introduce to you the guests of honor tonight. Let me first start by introducing Cass Sunstein, who is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He's also the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. Cass has testified before congressional committees on many, many subjects, and he's been involved in constitution making and law reform activities in a number of nations around the world. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Cass is a prolific writer and has made important contributions to very many different fields. Maybe his most relevant books, or certainly the most recent ones relevant for today's discussion, are Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness, that he co-authored together with Richard Thaler. Most recently, he has another book out called Simpler, The Future of Government, published in 2013. Before I move on to talk about Danny, let me share with you a bit more about Cass's life. In fact, Cass hails from Massachusetts, something I just learned today from Concord. And of course, he's a Harvard graduate and was a member of the varsity squash team and the Harvard Lampoon. Now, his specialty is constitutional law, but an author who recently wrote about Cass said, but he has written on an alarming number of topics, including Wikipedia, animal rights, Bob Dylan's lyrics, and it goes on and on. The dean of the law school referred to him as the preeminent legal scholar of our time, the most prolific, the most cited, and the most influential. We're delighted to have you here tonight, Cass. Our guest of honor tonight, of course, is Danny Kahneman. Danny is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He's also professor of psychology and public affairs emeritus at the Woodrow Wilson School and the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Princeton University. He's also fellow of the Center for Rationality at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Danny has also written an unbelievable amount of important work and influenced many, many different fields. Of course, psychology, his home discipline, where he has been given many, many awards, including the Lifetime Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association. And then in 2002, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, my own discipline. Danny has led a beautiful, very interesting, inspiring life. And in thinking about my introductions today, I went back to what he had to say about himself for the Nobel Committee. So this is Danny now speaking, talking about his life when he was born in Tel Aviv, and at the time, but then spent his childhood in Paris, France. I'm going to quote, "I'll never know if my vocation as a psychologist was a result of my early exposure to interesting gossip, or whether my interest in gossip was an indication of a budding vocation. I grew up in a world that consisted exclusively of people and words, and most of the words were about people." He spent his adolescence time in Palestine, where he describes his life as a life-changing experience. For graduate school, he and his wife wife traveled to San Francisco to Berkeley. And he is describing how his landing in San Francisco airport was picked up by Amitabh Azioni, a famous sociologist who some of you might know, who took him and his wife to Berkeley. To those of you who have been at Berkeley, a somewhat interesting place, the Flamingo Motel on University Avenue, which literally it was a pink motel at which many of us, including I, have also stayed. I Googled it and have to report that it's now the Quality Inn and is yellow. Danny talks about his education kind of at great length and what graduate school meant to him. He also talks about how different psychology was at the time. I'm quoting again, the main landmarks were examinations, including enormous multiple choice tests that covered all of psychology. One question he remembers, which I couldn't answer, but of course I'm an economist and psychologist in this room surely could, is the following question. Which of the following is not a study of latent learning? Danny says that some of his most intellectual experiences in fact happened here in Massachusetts, not quite at Harvard, but at the Austin Ricks Clinic in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he studied with and worked with the psychoanalytic theorist David Rappaport, who influenced his work at the time tremendously. One of the most beautiful parts of Danny's bio is certainly when he describes his collaboration with Amos Tversky. I'm quoting, "The experience was magical. I had enjoyed collaborative work before, but this was something different." He talks about how much fun he had with Amos, and with the fun, how this discovered many new insights. Of course, this was the birth of thinking about heuristics and biases, about developing theories, about judgment and decision-making, about prospect theory, framing, and eventually leading to laying the foundation for behavioral economics. And that surely is something we'll learn much more about today when Cass is going to discuss with Danny here his life, his work, and his impact on academia, on the world of practice, and of all of us. Welcome, Danny. Before I leave the stage, a little bit of housekeeping. I should remind you that this is being filmed, so take that into consideration. The rest of us who aren't officially filming should please refrain from taking pictures, and also please do turn off your cell phones. We plan to have a panel discussion between our two guests here tonight first, and then we'll open to the audience more generally. We would like to invite you to ask questions, and we're particularly interested, as we say at the Kennedy School, in questions that end with a question mark. Enjoy.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. It's for me a great honor and pleasure to be here. I'll tell you what Danny may not remember, which is my first conversation with him, which was maybe 12 years ago, maybe 15. He called me up and said, first thing he said his name, and I said, "You're my hero." That was, I think, not a promising beginning for a good relationship, but he took it with great generosity, and we got to work. I got to work on a bunch of papers with him on punitive damages, and I can say that Danny remains my hero. All right, so I think, as Ira suggested, it'd be good to start with what's sometimes described as Kahneman and Tversky's Big Bang. That is the initial start of the work that became so transformative. So Danny, maybe you could tell a little bit about what initiated your conversations with Amos that became the heuristics and biases material?
Well, it really is a series of accidents. I mean, it sounds, when you look back at it, you can see a lot of logic and all making sense, but I invited Amos to present to a seminar I was teaching on applications of psychology, and he told us about research that was going on at the University of Michigan, which described people, well, it was about decision-making under uncertainty, and people were described as being approximately rational or conservatively rational. And the idea was that people are good intuitive statisticians, so that was the research that Amos reported. Now, that was a topic I had an opinion about. Israelis, by the way, have lots of opinions about many things, and so that was, but I had a firm opinion that people are not very good intuitive statisticians. I was teaching statistics, and I knew that I was not a very good intuitive statistician, nor were my students. And so we debated that. We found that we liked talking to each other. And one thing led to another. We decided to collaborate on a study of whether professionals in people who do mathematical psychology or statistics, their intuitions about statistical issues are good or not. And that started a collaboration. The main thing that was the engine of the collaboration was that we just enjoyed each other's company enormously. So we were laughing all the time. He was very, very funny. And when I was with him, I was funny too, which I normally am not. But so it was just sheer joy. And that began a very close association where we spent every day. We would spend 5 or 6 hours together, and that went on for a period of years. And that's how we did our work. So there was no separation between work and fun. But it started with the definition of the problem as, how do people think under uncertainty? Or how do people assign probabilities to events? That's how we started. And we worked on that problem for about 5 years.
And now, as the story goes, consistent with what you said, Amos's presentation was that people were good intuitive statisticians. Yeah. Did he have some resistance to the idea, or did he find it?
No, he was just describing research. I mean, it is so easy to show that people are not very good intuitive statisticians that, no, we agreed very quickly, and the rest was, we complemented each other in some pretty good ways. I mean, he was much better trained as a formal thinker and informal theory and formal decision theory. I had done mathematics as an undergraduate along with psychology, but I was not a formal thinker, a formal theorist. So he brought that sort of rigor and discipline. He was also a clearer thinker than I was. And I brought in a background in the study of vision, which turns out to be very, very useful. I mean, to this day, when I think about thinking, I really think about vision, because I think the rules of vision and the rules of perception really when you try to understand intuitive thinking, you go a long way if you understand perception. So that was where I came from. And the combination of those two, and the fact that we overlapped a lot, but we also had distinct areas of strength, that meant that we could understand each other very quickly, and also that we kept surprising each other. So it was an exceptionally lucky collaboration.
Here's a question about the role of serendipity and its relationship to substance. If you look at the original heuristics and biases work, there seemed to be 3 heuristics. It was availability, representativeness, and anchoring. And I guess in more recent work, whether anchoring is a heuristic is actually maybe not. So can you say a little bit about the fact that there are two and then one question mark next to another, and those have dominated so much of analysis in the last decades? Is that a coincidence that those three ended up being the ones, or what accounts for that? Or are the first two the really most important, do you think?
Well, in the first place, I don't really quite believe in some of this anymore. I mean, it's been 40 years since that paper was published, and I have moved a little. What we had, the notion of heuristic that we had, which appeared in the book that I published a couple of years ago in Thinking Fast and Slow, was the idea that when you try to answer a question, you sometimes answer a different question. And I call that now attribute substitution. And that happens a lot. And it is not limited to representativeness or availability or anchoring. We do that all the time. That is, when we are asked a difficult question, it's actually quite surprising. We're not stumped. It's very rare that we are asked a question. We're asked a question and we're dumbfounded. Normally, an answer comes to mind very, very easily and very naturally. And it comes to mind typically because it's the answer to another question that is more readily available. So in general, I think that's a broader view of heuristics, and representativeness and availability are just two examples. As to the question you raise, it's true that both of these, the research on these three phenomena has been very salient in the field. Whether it could have been different, I don't know. Well, I'll give you an example. For a while, I thought that here is a completely different heuristic, that when I'm asked the probability of an event, there is actually something I do which is neither of the above. I try to imagine the event occurring, and I try to imagine how surprised I would be. That's a surprise heuristic, in a way. It is not the same, it is more deliberate than representativeness and availability. It is less intuitive. So as intuitive heuristics, as general purpose intuitive heuristics, representativeness and availability do seem more salient than others, but there are many, many heuristics.
Okay, is the idea that those two are the dominant ones for probability judgments? There are a range of other judgments, like, what should I believe about some political issue or some business issue, where there might be a trustworthy person heuristic, or there might be a what's going to happen in the next year heuristic, which would be different.
Well, we did research on people's willingness to pay for causes, for example, to save various animals, various species. Well, it turns out that the amount that people, it's an impossible question. How much are you willing to pay to save the panda or something like that? Turns out a number comes to their mind, and that's what they're willing to pay, and that's what they really pay. And it turns out when you study this, that there is a heuristic, and this is, how much do I like this animal? So people are willing to pay much more for pandas than for other bears, and not at all for ferrets, and it's the popularity of animals. And so you're asked one question, you answer another. There's really no limit to that substitution process.
Okay, so would it be right to say that if we're doing the paper now, we'd have something like an affect heuristic, which would be from a different direction, less cognitive, that would...
Well, it turns out, by the way, there is a third heuristic that is at least as important as representativeness and availability, and that is called the affect heuristic, which is how do I feel about this? And we did not develop this because we were very focused on the cognitive aspect, on thinking, but the affect heuristic is the third big one.
And I know you've written things along those lines. I want to ask a question about that. Would it be right to say that the affect heuristic itself isn't foundational, that it would have something behind it, which might be availability or representativeness or an incident?
No, I mean, I feel it's foundational. I'm asked the question, I like the panda, that's not availability, it's just my emotional response to it.
It might be a cuteness heuristic, which would lie behind affect, or vulnerability.
The odd thing is that when you try to characterize intuitive thinking, then cuteness and so on, that's a little too refined. There is something that happens very quickly, and that's evaluation. It happens in a fraction of a second. Do you want to approach this or to avoid it? Do you like it or do you dislike it? It's vulnerability, cuteness, all these, they come later, they're much more refined, and my sense is that when we're talking intuitive heuristics, we're talking about the cruder kind, and those are the subjects of substitution.
You say a little bit on anchoring and why you no longer include it in the list.
Well, because anchoring really doesn't, well, let me backtrack. Amos and I were actually quite confused about something, which we were never completely clear about whether the heuristics that we talked about were deliberate heuristics, were strategies of thinking, or were intuitive heuristics, something that just happens to you. And it was sort of mixed in our treatment of it, especially with respect to availability. That is, availability, we almost described it as, I ask you how many divorces are there at your university, among the professors at your university, so you think about cases as if this is your plan to see how easily those cases come to mind. And we thought of anchoring that way. So it was a more deliberate, at the time, that was one possible interpretation of anchoring, was deliberate. I start from one place and I adjust away from it. I don't believe that anymore at all. And I believe that the interesting heuristics are really intuitive. It's something that just happens to you. And anchoring doesn't fit the description of something being substituted for something else. So one mechanism, turns out Amos and I had different views about anchoring. I don't want to get too technical about this. Turns out that we were both right, but that became clear only about 30 years after our disagreements. But the way...
Does that mean you were also both wrong?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were wrong in thinking that which we thought, we were quite sure about, that the other person was wrong. I mean, in fact, both of us were right. The process of anchoring is, as I understand it, that when I ask you, is the tallest redwood taller or less tall than 1,200 feet? There's something that I'm causing to happen in your head. You're thinking of tall trees. And if I ask, is the tallest redwood taller or less tall than 80 feet? You're not thinking of trees that are nearly as tall. And then I ask you, how tall is the tallest redwood? You're going to give different answers because I've put different things in your head. That doesn't fit the description of answering another question than the question you were asked. It biases the answer, but it is that question that you're answering.
Okay, good. There's so much here. Should we say then that anchoring is a special case of a more general phenomenon that doesn't fit within the category of heuristics?
Yeah, I mean...
And what would we call that? The things that are put in your head that bias?
Sure. Anchoring is a context effect. That is, our thought is dominated by, by context. Our intuitive thinking is dominated by context. Our interpretations of what happens is dominated by context. And anchoring is an example, as I understand it, an example of a context effect. So I put a number in your head, and it changes your interpretation of things. That's a context effect.
Good.
A heuristic is just answering the wrong question. Answering a difficult question by answering an easier one. That's what I call a heuristic. This is really inside baseball. I mean, you know,
it's pretty interesting inside baseball, though, because I don't recall that having been written up, though maybe it has been, that the context effects, like, you know, people go to the middle of three products, one expensive, one cheap, then the middle looks more attractive, and that's manipulable. That colors, vividness can be affected by context. And seeing anchoring as part of that, that's pretty interesting.
Yes, and some context effects are deliberate. I mean, you know, it's what happens to you when you're weighing things. They're not intuitive. Intuitive context effect change your interpretation of things. Priming is a context effect. Actually, I want to tell a story about this because it explains priming and context effects, I think, better than any other story, and it's not in the book because it happened to me since, but it's something that my wife and I were at dinner with a couple, and then, you know, we were exchanging notes, and my wife said of the man in the couple that he is sexy. And okay. But then the next thing that she said was completely bewildering. And the next thing that she said was, he doesn't undress the maid himself. And that was really very puzzling. I mean, you know, what on earth does she mean? He doesn't undress the maid himself. And it sounded crazy, but and so I asked her, what on earth do you mean? And it turns out that she had said he doesn't underestimate himself. Now, that is a context effect. You put one word and it changes, you know, it shapes your head in a particular way. And anchoring is very much like that.
Okay, two directions of questions or concerns about the heuristics and biases work. Direction number one, that as you said, there are a number of heuristics. We have two and, well, we have three, and then kind of a context effect. Given the sheer number, is it the concern goes making predictions about what people will say about risk X is extremely difficult ex ante. So if you have something that triggers availability and affect and they go in different directions, what's going to happen?
Don't know. I mean, you know, we're at a very primitive stage of, you know, scientific psychology, and where basically the kind of thing that we established are directional findings. You know, so the more easily instances come to mind, the more probable something appears to us. This is directional, and when there are forces acting in opposite directions, we really cannot make predictions without bringing in more intuition about which of these forces is stronger than the other. But those intuitions are typically not scientific.
That's a troubling conclusion, isn't it, if so? Because, for example, we won't know with respect to genetic modification of food or nuclear power or coal-fired power plants. People are going to overestimate or underestimate risks?
Well, it's a matter of assessing the ease, I think, with which different thoughts come to mind, or of assessing the salience of different interpretations. So when we think of GMOs, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? What is the first emotion
For
that
me,
comes
cost-benefit analysis,
Yeah,
of
I know.
course.
That's and you're in a minority, Cass, as you may have. For most people, GMOs, there is affect associated with it, and so knowing the affect is going to tell you a great deal. So here, quite often, I find that as a heuristic question, if you want to try to predict how people will act, or asking what is the first impulse, that is a useful heuristic, because typically that first impulse is going to be the core, and there are going to be rationalizations, and people are going to adjust from it. But that core is going to be there, and it's going to remain very influential. And in the way that I think about these things, and again, I keep quoting my book because that's the only thing I know these days, but that's the idea. I speak there of two systems, system one, which is the intuitive one, and system two, the more deliberate one. But the idea is that system one is really the one that's the more influential. It is guiding system two. It is steering system two to a very large extent. So asking what is the opinion of system one is a good way to get into problems.
And suppose they're in conflict, where system one, let's stipulate, says genetic modification of food, bad. System two says cost-benefit analysis, let's just stipulate, okay. Who adjudicates?
For most people, it isn't even close. For most people, it's their affect that's going to... I think that it's quite rare that you encounter people who will say, I really feel deep aversion for this, but it's the right thing to do. It happens. But if you ask me what do I expect to happen, I expect the affect heuristic to win over cost-benefit analysis for most people most of the time.
You're breaking my heart. Which is an affective response unintentionally. Okay, so that's one direction of questions about the multiplicity of heuristics and how to handle that. We have some avenue. Another direction of questioning about says that in contexts, the heuristics have ecological rationality. So there's now a research program that suggests when the availability heuristic is working, or representativeness, it's in domains in which people are choosing pretty well. Is that an idea that you think fits well with your current thinking, or is it one that's happy talk?
I mean, think about it. Most of the time, the heuristic lead to pretty good answers. Intuitive thinking, by and large, works beautifully. We can generate problems where, because you're answering a question that is not exactly the one that you were asked, we can generate problems where you will be led to an answer that is incorrect in a particular context. But the question that you answer is correlated with the question that you should be answering. And so by and large, following availability, there is a correlation between availability and frequency and availability. So both statements are true. Heuristics typically, quite often, lead you to approximately adequate answers, and occasionally they lead you astray under predictable, in predictable circumstances.
Okay, that leads, I think, to the only part of the book where we might have a bit of a disagreement, where you actually engage with it, which is that on risk regulation, Paul Slovic, someone whom we both greatly admire, emphasizes lay rationality, as he calls it, and says that lay people are alert to values that ordinary people have and that technocrats lack. And under the influence of some of your work, some of us think that, hold on now, lay people are just making mistakes where the heuristic misfires. And those are contexts where you really want to go with the truth, not with the intuition. Slovik doesn't see things quite that way, and you don't quite either.
No, okay, so the debate is this. Suppose people, there was a big ALAR. Most of you are too young to remember this, but there was an incident with a pesticide that was used, for apples, growing apples, and there was a finding that it's causes cancer in mice in extraordinarily large quantities and so on, and there was a panic. And people stopped eating apples. I mean, the economic damage and probably the health damage was really quite substantial.
They actually rewrote the book of Genesis accordingly.
But I think this is something I read that you described about the person who asked that he has apple juice and can he pour it down the sink or should he go to the dump? So it was that level of hysteria. And Slovik points out, Slovik doesn't want to admit that the public can be so totally wrong. He said that, you must accept the judgment of people, the emotions of people. I'm with you that people are making a mistake. I'm not sure I'm completely with you when you say, well, truth should prevail. Because the fact is that if people have emotions, that's a political fact. You might as well acknowledge it. And also, you should have some sympathy for those people who are making mistakes or emotional mistakes. So I feel that the cost-benefit analysis is a little cold. And I feel that Paul's attempts to say that there is rationality in foolishness is wrong. So on that, I agree with you.
Good. Last question on heuristics and biases. Can you say a bit about intellectual progenitors? And there's a kind of footnote to this question, which is, Iris referred to something I hadn't known, which is you had a psychoanalyst who had a teacher, I guess, who had a big impact on you. Can you say a little bit about Freud?
I mean, it will sound a little arrogant, but no, we didn't. And that, by the way, is true in a lot of scientific work. That you start working on a problem and you develop your ideas, and then you prepare to write the paper and you look for sources because you want to appear scholarly. But the idea is frequently, developed independently. In our case, the idea of heuristics really came from perception. It came from an analysis from the example of how people perceive distance and size. And so that was the origin. I actually don't think that many people had gone the route that we went. In that sense, I'm not even sure they were progenitors.
Can you say a little bit about either any influence from Freud or about anything you would like to say about Freud?
I would say none. And what's happened in psychology in the last 20 years, they have rediscovered the unconscious, in some sense. So there is a lot of unconscious thinking and unconscious decision making. Not all of it is completely solid. We now worry about that, but some of it is undoubtedly true. So there is new interest in the unconscious. But it didn't come from Freud. It came from experimental psychology. And then people are saying, well, if you had paid attention to Freud, you would have done it differently or better. But it really didn't come from that. So you can find parallels, but it's not important to the actual genesis of the ideas.
And is it your view that Freud had a conception of the mind and processing that's way outstripped by modern techniques, or that there was soundness in it?
You know, certainly what he was describing was not based on the kind of data that would be acceptable in psychology today. And it's also clear that he had, you know, extraordinarily fine insights into human behavior. He described the mind in ways that, again, we find today, including, say, in my book. I mean, you know, the dichotomies of the mind, passion versus reason, you know, that they existed long before Freud, but Freud, the ego and the id, was one such dichotomy. Today, we have a dichotomy between automatic and controlled. That is, it resembles passion versus reason in the sense that the automatic has more emotion to it and the controlled has more deliberation to it. But it's really not the same. And it came from somewhere else entirely. It came from research on visual search. That's where the modern concepts of automatic and control came from. So frequently the references to the past, they're intellectually interesting, but if you take them too seriously, you miss out on the real genesis of the ideas.
Okay, great. Okay, some questions on happiness. There's work on life satisfaction that asks for a global judgment, and then what you've pioneered is the day reconstruction method, where you try to figure out how much people are enjoying their lives moment to moment. Can you say a little bit about why you thought the latter direction had advantages that the former global measure lacked, and your current view about virtues and vices?
Well, I did research on what I called experience utility, that is, the experiences of pleasure and pain. And the reason I was interested in this was a question that I raised in conversation with Amos Tversky, and we just never got around to study them. But here was a puzzle that I had. And suppose you will get a series of injections, painful injections, one a day. And they're equally painful. You will not adapt. And so every day there is another one. And every day it's just as painful as the day before or the day after. If you have such a series of injections, in principle, 20 injections is exactly twice as bad as 10. And yet, it's very clear that in our intuitions, you know, how much we would be willing to avoid 20 or to avoid 10, it's not going to be double. It's going to be completely different. So I was very curious about experience utility, about the actual experience, and then how you remember the experience and how you make decisions about that experience. And we did research that showed that people's memories do not correspond to their actual experiences. That was, in particular, the time that experiences last seemed not to matter at all. What really matters is the peak and the end, at least a category of experiences that we study. So there was a discrepancy between what actually happens to you over time and how you remember it later. And I studied that for a while in the 1990s. And then I noticed that in research on well-being, people were only asked about their memory. I mean, typically, you're asked, how satisfied are you with your life, or how happy have you been, or how happy are you these days? This is an integrative question which has to do with how you remember and evaluate an extended episode. And I thought that the reality is more important. You know, what you actually experience is more important than what you remember. So I went on to that attempt to measure with actual experience. We did not pioneer, we invented a technique, but the idea of measuring moment-by-moment experience, that was already available, and it's called experience sampling. People, you know, go around with, say, a telephone that buzzes, and then they're asked questions. How do you feel right now? So this idea of measuring experience, we didn't invent it, but we brought it into happiness research. That I think I can take some credit for. At the time, I thought that this was really the most important one. That what people, you know, whether people are happy in their life is more important than how happy they are when they think about their life. And I wrote quite extreme statements about this because it was a counterintuitive idea, provocative idea, and so I wrote and eventually I had to change my mind. And I had to change my mind because it turns out that when people make plans for the future and make decisions about the future, they're not trying to maximize the quality of their experience. They are probably doing something that is more like maximizing the retrospective evaluation of those experiences. So in a way, when you think about the future, you're maximizing the qualities of your anticipated memories. And I think that's true. This is actually what people do. Now, if this is true, it's absurd to have a conception of well-being that has nothing to do with what people are actually trying to achieve. And so I'm now much more confused and mixed up than I thought I was 15 years ago.
Okay, well, why wouldn't one say, given that experience is what matters, and that one ingredient of experience is memory? So if you're having a day in which you're thinking, what a great time I had in Hawaii, that's a good day, that's part of experience. And that what we should measure is experienced well-being, which includes the quality of memories insofar as that's part of experienced well-being. But what we shouldn't think of as relevant is people's answer to a global question. How satisfied are you with your life? Which is not measuring either experienced well-being or memory when memory actually happens.
Well, you know, how to measure well-being is a big question. It's now a big applied question because there are many countries in which efforts are being made to actually measure well-being and to use it as an instrument for evaluating policy. And I think it would be a shame not to have measurements of actual experience included in that. But the satisfaction question, however imperfect it is a way of asking people, what is the degree to which you're accomplishing your goals? And goals are important. So satisfaction has something to do with goals. And no simple conception of well-being will do. That's what troubles me. And what troubles me in that context is the use of the word happiness to cover the whole thing. And the word happiness by now has very little meaning because it's been applied to so many different measures.
Okay, press a little bit on that. Wouldn't we think that if people aren't experiencing or achieving their goals, that would affect their lives?
Well, you know, you mentioned earlier the role of memory in experience. For that, I have a vivid personal memory. I had the best vacation in my life, which was in Antarctica. We spent 3 weeks on a cruise. It was just marvelous. And that was, I don't know, some 8-10 years ago. And how much have I consumed that memory since? And now, I'm not a big one on memories, and I've never opened the folder of photos that we took at that time, but my guess is, I must have consumed that memory 35 minutes in the last 8 years. So as a component of my experience, that memory doesn't count for much. Because, the amount of time we spend remembering is not a lot of our experience.
Okay. Here's another way to get at, I think, the question I'm asking. What I'm asking is, what's missed by a measure of experienced well-being that includes memory? I hope this isn't too esoteric, because it does affect, not only policy, but our own conception of what lives should be like. We do have results, correct me if this is inaccurate, that people who have disabilities have surprisingly small deterioration in experienced well-being. And yet we also have data suggesting that people who have disabilities would be willing to pay a ton, including in reduced lifespan, to eliminate their disability. Now, that's an anomaly, isn't it? That their experienced well-being is only modestly smaller, and yet they'd be willing to give up a lot, even years. Now, there are multiple possible interpretations of this puzzle. What's the right one?
Oh, fortunately I didn't pretend to understand this. As I said, I used to think I understood it, but findings like this, and they're very dramatic, because you have people with medical procedures that are reversible, like a colostomy. Let's not go into details, but it's not a good one. And so you can measure people's mood and affect while they are in that treatment. And it's pretty normal. And then you ask them, you reverse the treatment, so they're now back to normal, and you ask them, how was it? And they said it was horrible, and I would give anything not to go back to it. Now, what is true? And I don't know.
Okay.
I'm really completely puzzled by
okay, this is related maybe to some of what we started talking about errors and availability and representativeness, both. So why wouldn't we say that the people who are saying they'd give anything not to be back there, or people who say during an experience, I'd give anything to get out of it, if their life experience isn't bad, they're just making some kind of mistake.
Yeah. It's an attractive position, to say you're making a mistake, but that is, that's a criticism of cost-benefit analysis. When people say you're playing God, you are telling people what they ought to be feeling and what they ought to be wanting. And here you get people, they've had the experience, you haven't. And so for you to say, oh, you're making a mistake because, if you get that colostomy again, you'll be in a good mood again. It's a difficult position to be in.
What I'm wondering is whether what might be missed, this is taking a direction different from the one that you took early and that you no longer have, so it's supporting your current ambivalence, is that a couple things are missed by the experience measure. One is people's sense of their own capabilities, and another is the sense of what kind of meaning their life has. So if you're struggling with a disability, even if your moods are good, you might think, I want my life to have more meaning than is possible given this state. Or you might think, I want to have some capacities, even if they wouldn't make me smile more.
The issue of the meaningfulness of life is another puzzling one. For a student of happiness, the meaning of life is too big a question anyway. But it's a very strange thing when you study well-being. The topic of the meaning of life never comes up unless you raise it. That is, we ask hundreds of thousands of people, Now, what were the best moment of your day? And they almost never say anything meaningful. You know, it's not, it was, you know, I had that moment with my child, I had that moment with my friend. It's usually social. And yet, so when you ask people, how important is it for you to have meaning in your life? They say it's the most important thing in my life. And so again, there is that discrepancy between what's, you know, the role of meaning in experience and the role of meaning in memory. And it is absolutely true that on a day where you did something truly meaningful, like you spend, you know, an hour doing charitable work, when you go to bed at night, that hour is going to loom larger than the rest of the day. So in memory, meaningful activities have a completely different weight than they have in experience. Now, that raises the question again, which should count, the memory or the experience? And if it is true that what people are trying to do is they are trying to get good memories, then that, you know, that is bound to give some weight to it. So it's not simply a mistake, because this is what people are trying to do.
A little story. I asked a colleague in government after a period who actually has a lot of experience with these issues in academic life, who was in government at the time, how are things going? And his response was, well, day-to-day well-being down, life satisfaction up. Okay, I want to ask you, we're going to get to questions very soon. I want to ask you, where would you like to see the field of social science going in the next 5 years, the next 10 years? If it could go in any direction, you're a dictator.
You know, I'm going to be 80 years old in a month. You shouldn't be asking me questions about the future. The future doesn't belong to me, and you know, I feel I'm not even entitled to have opinions about it.
Okay, then I'll ask you a question about the present. Can you say something about the last 5 years, last 10 years work on neuroscience, and whether you think that's helpful? Or,
you know, obviously, you know, obviously we are, for the foreseeable, you know, for the next 10 years, 15, 20, it's going to be the brain is going to take over. And the reason we know that for sure is because the most talented people are going there. And so, you know, it's the same thing as with behavior economics. When you get that many people picking behavior economics as a specialization, then you know that they're going to fill faculty positions, and for the next 20 years or so, that's going to be a very important part of this course. So the brain is certainly going to be dominant, but that's going to happen.
Okay, great. I think the floor is open for questions.
And you'll have to repeat the question, because very likely I won't hear them.
Okay. We have 3 microphones, and we're indulging the ask questions heuristic on the ground that both your life satisfaction and your moment-to-moment happiness and your sense of meaning will go up as a result.
Hi there. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, there's a startup in Silicon Valley called the Center for Applied Rationality that teaches the cognitive science from you and your field, but in a way that tries to implement in the daily practice of companies and entrepreneurs. And I was wondering what you thought about how to apply the actual findings of cognitive research into daily life.
Okay,
You'll have to translate.
For the
My
audience.
hearing is awful today, so
Okay, for the audience generally, that question was how to apply the findings of cognitive science to daily life and business, I guess.
well, you know, I don't exactly know what you mean by to apply. If we're in the business of giving people advice about how to think better or make better decisions, I'm fairly skeptical about it at the individual level. If we are talking about improving procedures of judgment and decision making within organizations, I'm much more optimistic, and I think there is a lot of room for improving things in many organizations. So I'm not sure I have a better answer than that.
Okay, thank you.
Did you think, just a little follow-up, that Moneyball is a classic study?
Yeah, Moneyball is, for those who don't know, I mean, one of the implications of the study of judgment is that the less of it you have, the better, in the sense that if you can replace judgment by formulas that are based on empirical results, you're likely to do better than by using unaided judgment. And Moneyball was, many of you have seen the film, it was an application of that to baseball. You know, let's do something systematic instead of following our intuitions. And it is a prime example of an application that was successful.
As are the 3 World Championships by the dynastic Boston Red Sox.
Thank you for coming. In Thinking Fast and Slow, you wrote about the investment management industry, and you said that, quote, it appears to be built largely on an illusion of skill. So my question is, if successful active investing is mostly, if not entirely, based on luck, do business schools do a disservice when giving rewards to successful investors and regarding them as role models and value creators?
Okay, so for the audience, the question was that Thinking Fast and Slow talks about money managers often as lucky rather than skillful, and basically that there's a kind of optical illusion that the money managers are smart. And so the question is, do business schools make a mistake when they hold up active investors as smart role models?
Finance is not my field. I'm a consumer of the research on that. And to some extent, I think I'm a biased consumer. That is, I'm likely to resonate to studies that are skeptical about intuitive experts and about people who claim to have expertise. And I would say that the evidence that on average, the evidence clearly favors passive investment over active investment on average. Now you get outliers who seem to do better. Some of them have inside information and so set them aside or send them to jail or do something. And others, it is at least possible, are lucky, but the people I know in behavioral finance from whom I derive whatever I say, they are careful about saying there is no skill ever. Say maybe there is skill, but there is very little of it. And if you're in the business of investing your money, don't count on somebody who claims that they have skill, because you're likely making a mistake. Go to index funds.
Thank you.
Sir.
So it seems like many of the behavioral economics results, present a scenario and then ask a significant number of people and then average the results and detect the effect in the average. But I'm curious how important it is to dive into the population and consider the people who don't show the variations within the population. For instance, there are some people who will accept the risk of 10 to gain 11, and is it important to consider those people?
So the question was that a lot of the behavioral work takes population-wide averages, and that there are some people who will follow expected utility theory and not prospect theory. They'll just run the numbers. Isn't it important, the question asks, to dig into the heterogeneity?
I think my answer to that may have changed in recent years. Okay, when we're talking of general principles of how the mind works, I think there are, if we distinguish automatic from controlled behavior, everybody has that. There is an interesting dimension which has to do with controlled behavior, with self-control, with self-reflection. Keith Stanovich, whom I cite a lot, and he is the originator of the term System 1 and System 2, he speaks of that dimension as a dimension of rationality, which he distinguishes from intelligence, which is whether people endeavor to think correctly and discipline themselves in thinking. So he is finding this an interesting dimension. There certainly are large differences in the degree to which people bring self-control and self-critique to bear on their judgments and their actions. It is in the nature of program of research like the one we did, that you start out by studying population averages and you do individual differences later. And the direction that Keith Stanovich is studying, the attempt to distinguish rationality from intelligence is really quite interesting. Whether it's going to be productive, I think it's a bit early to tell.
Thank you so much for coming. I suppose it's a bit preemptive to call Thinking Fast and Slow your seminal work, but in your very important work, Thinking Fast and Slow, you may well have been more finely attuned to your own personal biases and what heuristics you yourself fall victim to, I guess, to use the pejorative term. What would you say, which biases in particular, especially with regard to thinking of a prototypical layman, did you find yourself falling victim to, like lay rationality, as you were talking about earlier?
The question is, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow is vulnerable to which heuristics and biases in particular?
All of them? I mean, quite seriously, and Amos and I were studying biases and errors of judgment. We were studying our own. That's what made the study so interesting and so funny, that it was sort of ironic research. We were looking at our own biases. And I've been doing that for 45 years now. I've been in that field, and I really haven't improved at all. My intuitive thinking just follows the same rule, and I'm particularly bad at the thing that I teach the most and that I find the most interesting, which is making extreme predictions on the basis of limited evidence. I do that all the time. And, I can stop myself and say, oh my God, I'm ridiculous, but most of the time I don't stop myself. I just think this is right.
Little contrasting point. Gene Fama recently got the Nobel in economics. I've played tennis with him a number of times. He's the most rational tennis player. It's all calculative. When he hits a hard forehand, that's exactly the right shot to hit. No wonder he has trouble with Schiller. Maybe not on the tennis court, but...
Good evening, Dr. Kahneman. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. A lot of the behavioral science literature focuses on developed world populations, and I was wondering if you could speak perhaps to how heuristics and biases may be sensitive to different cultural or behavioral norms, and perhaps how they would manifest differently in the developing country context, and what policy implications of that would be.
Okay, so the question is about the differences across cultures of some of the behavioral findings, and in particular, whether you'd see differences in developing countries.
I know very little about this, and I would say, if the picture that I try to draw in the book is anywhere near right, in a certain sense, you wouldn't expect very large cultural differences, because if there is an automatic system and the rules are basically the rules of visual perception, you wouldn't expect many major differences in the composition or in the constitution of heuristics. you would expect large cultural differences in content, in what people value, and in some beliefs. Like, for example, optimism is clearly culturally influenced, and there are cultures that value optimism, and there are cultures where optimists look rather silly. I'm told that's true in Hungary, that it's foolish to be an optimist. To some extent, it certainly is true in France. So there are differences between cultures, but those are content differences or value differences. Differences in mechanisms look implausible to me.
Sir.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm curious to know, how is human thinking evolving over time? Let's say if you think of human beings 500 years ago, was it different in the way they thought then and the way we think now? And like carrying that forward, like let's say 100, 200 years from now, do you think the biases, the heuristics that we have would change? Or is it something inherent about them, something so fundamental that they're essential for our survival?
So the question is about evolution over time. Did people think differently in relevant respects 500 years from now? And how about 500 years ago? And what about 500 years from now? Footnote, I had a lot of trouble asking about 5 years from now, so I'm not sure you're going to do a lot better.
Well, again, the basic machinery, you don't expect that it will evolve over the next 300 or 500 years. I mean, evolution just doesn't work that fast. The content and what the culture imposes, or the modes of thinking that the culture values, that can change. I think we are, to a significant extent, there are cultural differences in the attitude to reason. Now, even in the most reasonable cultures, reason doesn't prevail, but there is a continuum, and it's quite possible that things have changed in the last 500 years. The kinds of authorities to which we appeal have changed. In part, it is content, but in part, it has something to do with whether we value self-criticism, with whether we value critical thinking. Attitudes to that have changed and could change in future. Human nature will not, I think, change very quickly.
Hi. Do you think we're going to be able to find biological or evolutionary explanations for all of our defects? Or are there some ways in which we're just inexplicably defective?
Okay, so the question was, are there biological or evolutionary explanations for these findings, or for some, I guess?
Well, the question is what you mean by evolutionary explanations. One type of evolutionary explanation is to take a behavior or to take a phenomenon and to say, if it exists, it must have evolved, it must be adaptive, it must be the optimal answer to some problem. And there are some researchers who use this as a heuristic. That is, if you find a behavior that strikes you as odd or as puzzling, you look for a way of explaining why in some sense it is optimal. I don't feel the urge to do that myself. I think the machinery of the mind has evolved. It is certainly far from optimal. It's evolved in response to many. It is far from optimal for solving the problem of the 21st century. It's evolved under various pressures of getting solutions to problems quickly, acting very quickly, and acting carefully. So But the idea that the neglect of base rate is an evolutionary adaptation, that doesn't strike me as sensible. The idea that the brain has evolved sounds to me as obvious, and I don't know what to make of it when I'm looking at base rate neglect. So I haven't found that line of inquiry very useful in my own thinking. Other people really live by it. Those are differences.
It's also the case, isn't it, that many people find it very comforting to find evolutionary explanations, and many other people find it disturbing.
Thank you for coming. Professor Kahneman, you pointed out that there's still a lot of work to be done in developing the empirical basis of behavioral sciences. You even used the term primitive when you described it earlier. At the moment, there's quite a big appetite for the application of behavioral sciences in public policy. And I just wondered whether you thought there's a risk that currently the science is too primitive to be widely applied without possibly causing more harm than good.
With a British accent, he says, where they have the nudge unit in the UK. Okay, so the question is it premature, please don't say yes, to use behavioral findings in public policy?
I beg your pardon?
The question is it premature to use behavioral findings given the, in some ways, primitive nature of the findings? Is it premature, the questioner asks, to use this in public policy?
Well, no, I don't think it is premature.
There we go.
I think, I couldn't, even if I thought so, I wouldn't say so next to Cass, but I really don't think so. I think, we don't know much, but we know a few things, and we know a few things that can be put to use. And I think, for example, the idea that people are prone to pick the default option. That's a finding. Can be used for better or for worse, but it's solid enough so that it's usable. And there is a whole range of findings. So I refer you to the book Nudge, and to a lot of more recent research that's been done in the UK and elsewhere on actual applications of these ideas to improving the lives of people and to improving the quality of their decisions. So I don't think we need to wait until we understand everything to apply what we understand today. And there is a fair amount that we do understand.
We have time, I think, for one more question.
So you mentioned that we're still in the process of learning more about the directional forces that drive heuristic biases and different biases. What is your sense, or what would be your intuitive hunches for what's the directional forces underlying the different heuristics? And if you think that that's a space that could vary by culture or vary by context.
Okay, so the question is, what are the directional forces that vary, that drive the use of heuristics? What are the forces that drive them? And how would they vary across cultures?
I mean, I don't think of heuristics as being driven by forces. In the way that I described it, you have an associative machinery, you have memory. A question is asked. No answer comes immediately to mind, but that to the exact question, but activation spread through the associative system and some other answer comes to mind that is somehow related. That's how I describe the operation of heuristics. So I don't see a need for driving forces any more than I would see a need to explain, for driving forces to explain why we see objects at a particular distance. We have a machinery that is in a way designed by evolution to locate objects in a three-dimensional world, and that machinery just acts. I don't think of it in terms of driving forces or culture providing an impetus for that. This is just the way the mind works, if my understanding of it is correct. It's a big if.
Okay, well, System 1 and System 2 are sometimes in some conflict, we've learned, but with respect to today's events, just looking around the room, System 1 and System 2 are in complete accord. System 1 is very grateful for an extraordinary talk, and System 2 is highly supportive of that gratitude.
Thank you, Cass.
We've got 90 minutes. And thanks to you all for coming.
Okay. Dinner?
Dinner.
Mathematical psychology or statistics, their intuitions about statistical issues are good or not. And that started a collaboration. The main thing that was the engine of the collaboration was that we just enjoyed each other's company enormously. So we were laughing all the time. He was very, very funny. And when I was with him, I was funny too, which I normally am not. But so it was just sheer joy, and that began a very close association where we spent every day. We would spend 5 or 6 hours together, and that went on for a period of years, and that's how we did our work. So there was no separation between work and fun. But it started with the definition of the problem as how do people think under uncertainty, or how do people assign probabilities to events? That's how we started. And we worked on that problem for about 5 years.
And now, as the story goes, consistent with what you said, Amos's presentation was that people were good intuitive statisticians. Yeah. Did he have some resistance to the idea, or did he find it?
No, he was just describing research. I mean, it is so easy to show that people are not very good intuitive statisticians. That no, we agreed very quickly, and you know, the rest was we complemented each other in some pretty good ways. I mean, he was much better trained as a formal thinker and informal theory and formal decision theory. I had done mathematics as an undergraduate along with psychology, but I was not a formal thinker, a formal theorist. So he brought that sort of rigor and discipline. He was also a clearer thinker than I was. And I brought in a background in the study of vision, which turns out to be very, very useful. I mean, to this day, when I think about thinking, I really think about vision, because I think the rules of vision and the rules of perception really when you try to understand intuitive thinking, you go a long way if you understand perception. So that was where I came from. And the combination of those two, and the fact that we overlapped a lot, but we also had distinct areas of strength, that meant that we could understand each other very quickly.
That's okay. And if anything,
Good
I'm asking
afternoon.
is a bad question, say the word automatic.
I'm Iris Bonet. I join you from across the river. I'm the academic dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm also a co-chair of the Behavioral Insights Group at the Center for Public Leadership at HKS. It's an enormous honor for me to introduce to you the guests of honor tonight. Let me first start by introducing Cass Sunstein, who is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He's also the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. Cass has testified before congressional committees on many, many subjects, and he's been involved in constitution making and law reform activities in a number of nations around the world. From 2009 to 2012, He was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Cass is a prolific writer and has made important contributions to very many different fields. Maybe his most relevant books, or certainly the most recent ones relevant for today's discussion, are Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, that he co-authored together with Richard Thaler. Most recently, he has another book out called Simpler, The Future of Government, published in 2013. Before I move on to talk about Danny, let me share with you a bit more about Cass's life. In fact, Cass hails from Massachusetts, something I just learned today from Concord. And of course, he's a Harvard graduate and was a member of the varsity squash team and the Harvard Lampoon. Now, his specialty is constitutional law, but an author who recently wrote about Cass said, but he has written on an alarming number of topics, including Wikipedia, animal rights, Bob Dylan's lyrics, and it goes on and on. The dean of the law school referred to him as the preeminent legal scholar of our time, the most prolific, the most cited, and the most influential. We're delighted to have you here tonight, Cass. Our guest of honor tonight, of course, is Danny Kahneman. Danny is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He's also professor of psychology and public affairs emeritus at the Woodrow Wilson School and the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Princeton University. He's also fellow of the Center for Rationality at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Danny has also written an unbelievable amount of important work and influenced many, many different fields. Of course, psychology, his home discipline, where he has been given many, many awards, including the Lifetime Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association. And then in 2002, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, my own discipline. Danny has led a beautiful, very interesting, inspiring life. And in thinking about my introductions today, I went back to what he had to say about himself for the Nobel Committee. So this is Danny now speaking, talking about his life when he was born in Tel Aviv, and at the time, but then spent his childhood in Paris, France. I'm going to quote, "I'll never know if my vocation as a psychologist was a result of my early exposure to interesting gossip, or whether my interest in gossip was an indication of a budding vocation. I grew up in a world that consisted exclusively of people and words, and most of the words were about people." He spent his adolescence time in Palestine, where he describes his life as a life-changing experience. For graduate school, he and his wife traveled to San Francisco, to Berkeley. And he is describing how his landing in San Francisco airport was picked up by Amitabh Etzioni, a famous sociologist who some of you might know, who took him and his wife to Berkeley. To those of you who have been at Berkeley, a somewhat interesting place, the Flamingo Motel on University Avenue, which literally it was a pink motel at which many of us, including I, have also stayed. I Googled it and have to report that it's now the Quality Inn and is yellow. Danny talks about his education, kind of at great length, and what graduate school meant to him. He also talks about how different psychology was at the time. I'm quoting again, "The main landmarks were examinations, including enormous multiple choice tests that covered all of psychology. One question he remembers, which I couldn't answer, but of course I'm an economist and psychologist in this room surely could, is the following question. Which of the following is not a study of latent learning? Danny says that some of his most intellectual experiences in fact happened here in Massachusetts, not quite at Harvard, but at the Austin Ricks Clinic in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he studied with and worked with the psychoanalytic theorist David Rappaport, who influenced his work at the time tremendously. One of the most beautiful parts of Danny's bio is certainly when he describes his collaboration with Amos Tversky. I'm quoting, "The experience was magical. I had enjoyed collaborative work before, but this was something different." He talks about how much fun he had with Amos, and with the fun, how this discovered many new insights. Of course, this was the birth of thinking about heuristics and biases, about developing theories, about judgment and decision-making, about prospect theory, framing, and eventually leading to laying the foundation for behavioral economics. And that surely is something we'll learn much more about today when Cass is going to discuss with Danny here his life, his work, and his impact on academia, on the world of practice, and of all of us. Welcome, Danny. Before I leave the stage, a little bit of housekeeping. I should remind you that this is being filmed, so take that into consideration. The rest of us who aren't officially filming should please refrain from taking pictures, and also please do turn off your cell phones. We plan to have a panel discussion between our two guests here tonight first, and then we'll open to the audience more generally. We would like to invite you to ask questions, and we're particularly interested, as we say at the Kennedy School, in questions that end with a question mark. Enjoy.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. It's for me a great honor and pleasure to be here. I'll tell you what Danny may not remember, which is my first conversation with him, which was maybe 12 years ago, maybe 15. He called me up and said, first thing he said his name, and I said, "You're my hero." That was, I think, not a promising beginning for a good relationship, but he took it with great generosity, and we got to work. I got to work on a bunch of papers with him on punitive damages, and I can say that Danny remains my hero. All right, so I think, as Ira suggested, it would be good to start with what's sometimes described as Kahneman Tversky's Big Bang. That is the initial start of the work that became so transformative. So Danny, maybe you could tell a little bit about what initiated your conversations with Amos that became the heuristics and biases material.
Well, it really is a series of accidents. I mean, it sounds, when you look back at it, you can see a lot of logic and all making sense, but I invited Amos to present to a seminar I was teaching on applications of psychology, and he told us about research that was going on at the University of Michigan, which described people, well, it was about decision-making under uncertainty, and people were described as being approximately rational or conservatively rational. And the idea was that people are good intuitive statisticians, so that was the research that Amos reported. Now, that was a topic I had an opinion about, Israelis, by the way, have lots of opinions about many things, and so that was, but I had a firm opinion that people are not very good intuitive statisticians. I was teaching statistics, and I knew that I was not a very good intuitive statistician, nor were my students. And so we debated that. We found that we liked talking to each other. And one thing led to another. We decided to collaborate on a study of whether professionals in people who do